Hey, my name is Walter Greer. I'm 70 years old and I live alone in a small white house on Maple Street in Cedar Falls, Iowa. It's the same house I brought my wife Dorothy home to 43 years ago. The same house where we raised two children, buried a dog named Chester in the backyard, and sat on the front porch every evening watching the sun go down behind the elm trees. The same house where Dorothy took her last breath in the bedroom upstairs while I held her hand and whispered that it was okay to go. That was 5 years ago. 5 years. 2 months and 11 days. But I stopped counting after the first year because counting made the numbers feel heavier than they already were. After Dorothy died, I didn't fall apart the way people expected. I didn't stop eating. I didn't stop shaving. I didn't sit in the dark and refuse to answer the phone. I kept the house clean. I mowed the lawn on Saturdays. I went to the hardware store when something needed fixing. I nodded at neighbors and said good morning and went to church on Sundays because Dorothy would have wanted me to. But there was one thing I couldn't stop doing, and it was the thing that would have worried her most. Every morning, I set 2 plates on the kitchen table. One for me, one for her. I didn't think about it. My hands just did it the way they had done it for over 4 decades. 2 plates, 2 forks, 2 napkins, 2 cups of coffee. I would sit down, eat my toast and eggs in silence, and then wash both plates even though only one had been used. I knew it wasn't normal. My daughter Karen told me so every time she called from Minneapolis. Dad, you need to stop doing that. It's not healthy. You're holding on to something that isn't there anymore. She said it gently, the way you talk to someone you think is losing his mind. My son Michael was less gentle. He lives in Denver and calls once a month, sometimes less. The last time he brought it up, he said, Dad, Mom's been gone 5 years. You can't keep pretending she's sitting across from you. I didn't argue with either of them. I just kept setting 2 plates. Because the morning I stopped, I would have to admit that the chair across from me was truly empty, and I wasn't ready for that. Cedar Falls is a quiet town. The kind of place where people wave from their cars and leave tomatoes on your porch in the summer without knocking. My neighbor on the left, Bill Henderson, died 2 years after Dorothy. His wife sold the house and moved to Florida. The new owners were a young couple who worked long hours and never seemed to be home. The house on my right had been empty for almost a year after old Mrs. Patterson went into the nursing home. Her children couldn't agree on what to do with the place. So it sat there with the curtains drawn and the grass growing tall until someone finally cut it down out of embarrassment. Then one Tuesday morning in late September, a moving truck pulled up. I was sitting on the porch with my coffee, watching the leaves start to turn, when 2 men in gray uniforms began carrying furniture through Mrs. Patterson's front door. The furniture was modest: a small dining table, a reading chair, a wooden bookshelf, boxes labeled kitchen and bedroom in neat handwriting. No children's toys, no men's boots, no heavy tools. Just the careful, pared-down belongings of someone who had decided what mattered and left the rest behind. I watched from my chair without getting up. In a small town, you learn to observe before you introduce yourself. About an hour later, a woman stepped out of the house and stood on the porch. She looked about my age, maybe 67 or 68. She had silver hair cut short and practical, a face that had been pretty once and was still handsome in that way that comes from years of smiling and worrying in equal measure. She wore a blue cardigan and brown shoes that looked like they had walked a lot of miles. She stood there with her hands in her pockets and looked at the street the way someone looks at a place they're not sure they belong in yet. Then she turned her head and saw me. I raised my coffee cup. She raised a hand. Neither of us spoke. That was how I met Margaret Hollis. I didn't learn her name until 3 days later. I was raking leaves in the front yard when she came down her porch steps carrying a small paper bag. She walked across the grass to the low fence between our properties and stopped. She didn't lean on the fence or step over it. She just stood there, close enough to talk, far enough to leave if she wanted to. I'm Margaret, she said. I just moved in. I noticed. I leaned on the rake. I'm Walter. Welcome to the street. She held up the paper bag. I made banana bread this morning. I always make too much. Would you like some? I looked at the bag, then at her. There was something careful in her eyes. The way someone offers kindness when they're not sure it will be accepted. I said, thank you. That's very kind. She set the bag on the fence post between us. When I unwrapped it later in the kitchen, the bread was still warm. I cut a slice and sat down at the table. 2 plates were already set. I put the bread on Dorothy's plate without thinking, then stopped. I stared at it for a long time. Then I moved it to my own plate and ate it. It was the best banana bread I'd had in years. Over the next few weeks, Margaret and I became what I suppose you'd call porch neighbors. She sat on her porch in the mornings. I sat on mine. Sometimes we waved. Sometimes we talked about the weather or the oak tree between our yards that was dropping acorns everywhere. She told me she had moved from a bigger house in Waterloo after her husband passed. His name was Frank. He had been a high school history teacher for 31 years. He died of pancreatic cancer 14 months ago. She said it plainly, without performance, the way people who have truly grieved learn to say hard things. He was sick for 8 months. I was with him every day. After he was gone, the house was too big. Every room had his voice in it. I thought a smaller place might help. I nodded. Did it help? She looked at the street. Some days I just feel lost in a smaller house instead of a bigger one. I understood that more than she knew. We didn't rush into friendship. At our age, you don't. You've been hurt enough to know that opening up to someone means giving them something they can break. But slowly, the conversations got longer. She told me about Frank's love of Civil War history and how he used to read aloud from books about Gettysburg while she cooked dinner. I told her about Dorothy's garden, how she had grown roses along the back fence that I still couldn't bring myself to dig up even though they had gone wild. Margaret asked me one morning, "Do you ever talk to him? I mean out loud, when no one's around?" I paused. I talk to her every night before I go to sleep. I tell her about my day. She smiled, not pitying, just recognizing. I do the same with Frank. I tell him about the weather, and what I ate, and whether the new neighbor seems like a decent man. I raised an eyebrow. "And what do you tell him?" She laughed softly. "I tell him you seem steady." That was the word she used. Steady. I carried it with me the rest of the day. One evening in mid-October, I was in the kitchen making dinner. If you could call it dinner. I had a can of soup on the stove and 2 slices of bread on the counter. The table was set the way it always was. 2 plates, 2 forks, 2 napkins, 2 cups. I was standing at the stove stirring the soup when I heard a knock at the back door. I opened it, and there was Margaret holding a casserole dish with oven mitts. She looked a little embarrassed. "I made a chicken casserole," she said, and I realized halfway through that I made enough for 4 people. I've been doing that ever since Frank died. I keep cooking for 2 and eating alone. I looked at the casserole, then at her. She glanced past my shoulder into the kitchen. I saw her eyes land on the table. 2 plates, 2 cups, 2 settings. She looked at me, and something in her face changed. I watched her understand. She didn't say anything about it. She didn't ask why there were 2 plates when I lived alone. She just looked at the empty chair, and then back at me, and I saw in her eyes the exact same loneliness I had been carrying for 5 years. She spoke so quietly I almost didn't hear her. "Set a place for me?" My throat closed. I stepped back and held the door open. She walked in and set the casserole on the counter. Then she looked at the table again. She picked up the plate from Dorothy's place, held it for a moment, then set it back down gently. She pulled out the chair and sat down. She didn't take Dorothy's place. She filled a different kind of space. One I hadn't known was there until that exact moment. We ate together. The casserole was simple but good. We didn't say much at first. Then she told me about a book she was reading, and I told her about the oak tree dropping acorns on my truck, and somehow an hour passed without either of us noticing. When she stood to leave, she paused at the door. "Thank you, Walter. I haven't eaten dinner with anyone since Frank." I looked at her standing in my kitchen doorway, this woman I barely knew who had somehow understood without a single explanation why there were 2 plates on my table every morning. I said, "Neither have I." After that night, we ate together 3 or 4 times a week, sometimes at my kitchen table, sometimes at hers. She cooked things Frank had loved: pot roast, chicken and dumplings, apple cobbler. I brought whatever I could manage, which was usually bread from the bakery and a decent bottle of wine from the store. We talked about everything and nothing. She told me about her daughter Claire, who lived in Chicago and called every Sunday. I told her about Karen and Michael. She told me about Frank's last months, how she had slept in a chair beside his hospital bed because she couldn't bear to be in their bedroom alone. I told her about Dorothy's last morning, how she had opened her eyes and said my name one more time before she was gone. We didn't try to fix each other's grief. We just sat beside it together, and somehow, that was enough to make the evenings feel less long. There were small moments during those weeks that stayed with me longer than they should have. One afternoon, Margaret was telling me about Frank's retirement party, how the students had made a video of all his best classroom moments, and she started laughing so hard she had to put down her coffee. Then the laughter turned into something else, and she pressed her hand against her mouth and looked away. I didn't say anything. I just sat there until she was ready to look at me again. When she did, her eyes were wet but steady. She said, "Sorry. Sometimes the happy memories are harder than the sad ones." I understood that completely. The sad memories you brace yourself for. The happy ones ambush you when your guard is down. Another evening, she noticed the photo albums on my bookshelf and asked if she could see them. We sat on the couch and I turned the pages slowly. Dorothy at 25, laughing in the rain outside the courthouse the day we got married. Dorothy holding Karen as a baby, looking exhausted and radiant. Dorothy standing in her garden with dirt on her knees and the proudest smile I had ever seen. Margaret looked at every photo carefully. She didn't rush. She didn't compare. She just said, she had the kindest face, and I thought, yes, she did. And somehow talking about Dorothy with Margaret didn't make me sad. It made me feel like Dorothy was still here in the room with us, just listening, just glad someone new was hearing the stories. One Saturday, I drove Margaret to the farmer's market in town. We walked between the stalls slowly, because neither of us was in any hurry. She picked up a jar of honey and held it to the light the way a jeweler holds a stone, turning it slowly, watching the amber catch the sun. I watched her do it, and thought about how long it had been since I had noticed someone enjoying a small thing. When you live alone, you stop seeing the world through anyone's eyes but your own. Everything shrinks, the colors fade. Having Margaret beside me made ordinary things feel larger again, like the world had quietly turned up its brightness while I wasn't looking. She caught me staring and raised an eyebrow. "What?" I shook my head. "Nothing. Just glad I'm here." She smiled and put the honey in the bag, and we kept walking. November came with cold wind and gray skies. The trees on Maple Street were bare. Margaret started bringing her reading chair closer to the window that faced my house. I noticed because I had started doing the same thing. One morning I looked out and saw her standing in her backyard staring at a patch of frozen ground where Mrs. Patterson used to grow herbs. She had her arms wrapped around herself and her head was down. I put on my coat and walked over. She didn't look up until I was right beside her. "I'm being foolish," she said. "I just miss having a garden." "Dorothy's rose bed is still back there," I told her. "It's a mess, but the soil is good. If you want, we could fix it up in the spring." She looked at me. "Together? If you don't mind working with an old man who doesn't know the difference between a weed and a flower." She laughed, and the sound was warm enough to push back the November cold. "I'd like that," she said. That night I lay in bed and spoke to Dorothy the way I always did. I told her about Margaret. I told her about the garden. I told her I wasn't trying to replace her. I was just tired of the quiet. And I swear, just for a second, I felt something like permission settle over the room, like a hand on my shoulder that wasn't there but was. The week before Thanksgiving, Karen called. She asked what I was doing for the holiday. I told her Margaret and I were going to cook dinner together. There was a long silence. "Who is Margaret?" "She's my neighbor. She moved in a couple of months ago. Her husband passed last year." Another silence. Longer this time. "Dad, are you dating this woman?" I felt my face get warm. "We're having Thanksgiving dinner." "Karen." "That's all." She didn't sound convinced. "I just don't want you to get confused, Dad. You're 70 years old? Sometimes loneliness makes people think they feel things they don't really feel." I held the phone away from my ear for a second and took a breath. Then I said, "Karen, I've been lonely for 5 years. I know exactly what loneliness feels like. And I know the difference between loneliness and something else." She went quiet. I could hear her thinking. "Just be careful," she finally said. "I will, but I need you to trust me." Michael called the next day. Karen had obviously spoken to him. His approach was more direct. "Dad." I looked up the property records. That house was sold to a Margaret Hollis from Waterloo. I felt a flash of anger I hadn't expected. "You looked up her property records. I just want to make sure she's not taking advantage of you." "She brought me a casserole, Michael. She's not running a con." He sighed. "I'm just worried." "I know you are. But I'm not a child and I'm not senile. I'm a grown man who's been eating alone for 5 years. And now I have someone to share a meal with. That's not something to worry about. That's something to be grateful for." He didn't say much after that. Thanksgiving was quiet and perfect. Margaret roasted a turkey that was too big for 2 people, and I made mashed potatoes the way Dorothy used to, with too much butter and not enough salt. We ate at my kitchen table. This time there were only 2 plates, and both of them were being used. After dinner, we sat on the couch in the living room with coffee. The house smelled like roasted turkey and cinnamon from the pie she had baked. Margaret looked at the framed photo of Dorothy on the bookshelf. She was beautiful, she said. She was. Do you think she would mind me being here? I looked at the photo. Dorothy was smiling in it, the way she always smiled, like the whole world amused her, and she was in on the joke. I think she'd be glad someone finally used the other plate. Margaret set down her coffee cup. She reached over and took my hand. Her fingers were warm. Walter, I need to tell you something. I looked at her. She took a breath. I went to the doctor last week. I've been having headaches. They ran some tests. My chest tightened, she went on. There's a small growth. They don't know yet if it's serious. I have more tests next week. She said it calmly, the way she said everything. But I could see the fear underneath. I squeezed her hand. I'll go with you. She shook her head. You don't have to do that. I know I don't. I want to. She looked at me for a long time. Then she whispered, I'm scared, Walter. I pulled her closer. So am I. But you're not going through this alone. We sat like that for a long time, her head against my shoulder, my arm around her, both of us old enough to know that time doesn't wait, and young enough in our hearts to be terrified of losing what we had just found. The week of tests was long. I drove Margaret to the hospital in Waterloo. I sat in the waiting room reading magazines I didn't care about while she was inside. When she came out, she looked pale and tired. I took her hand and walked her to the truck without asking questions. She wasn't ready to answer. The results came back on a Wednesday. Margaret called me from her kitchen. I could hear her voice shaking. It's benign, she said. The growth is benign. They want to monitor it, but it's not cancer. I sat down hard on my kitchen chair. Thank God. She laughed. But it was the kind of laugh that comes after you've been holding your breath for days. I'm coming over, I said. I crossed the yard in my slippers. She opened the door before I knocked. She was crying. Not from sadness, from relief, from the sudden release of fear that had been sitting on her chest for 2 weeks. I held her in the doorway of her kitchen, while the December wind blew through the screen door. Neither of us had remembered to close. I don't know how long we stood there. Long enough for the cold to seep through my sweater. Long enough for her tears to soak through my collar. Long enough for me to realize that the fear I had felt while waiting for her results wasn't the fear of losing a neighbor or a friend. It was the specific, sharp terror of losing someone you love. The kind I hadn't felt since the morning. Dorothy closed her eyes. That fear told me something I had been too careful to admit. This wasn't companionship. This wasn't two lonely people filling each other's evenings. This was love. Arriving late, arriving quietly. Arriving in a way I hadn't expected and didn't feel entitled to, but arriving all the same. When she pulled back, she looked up at me. I almost lost the chance to tell you something. She said, tell me now. She touched my face with both hands. At my age, Walter, you learn that waiting is the most foolish thing a person can do. So I'm not going to wait. I love you. I stood there in her kitchen, 70 years old, with her hands on my face and those words hanging in the air between us. And I thought about Dorothy. I thought about the 5 years of silence. I thought about the 2 plates on the table every morning, and the empty chair, and the nights I talked to a woman who couldn't answer me. And then I thought about Margaret, who had knocked on my door with a casserole and a quiet voice and asked me to set a place for her. I said, I love you too. I've been falling in love with you since the banana bread. She laughed through her tears. That was the first thing I made you. I know. Best banana bread I ever had. She kissed me then. It was gentle and warm and tasted like coffee and tears and the kind of courage you only find when you've lived long enough to know that second chances don't come around often. When we pulled apart, she said, what are we going to do about this? I said, I'm going to take you to dinner on Friday. A proper dinner. She raised an eyebrow. Walter Greer, are you asking me on a date? I'm 70 years old, Margaret. I'm too old to play games. Yes, I'm asking you on a date. She smiled. Then I accept. That Friday, I put on my good suit, the one I hadn't worn since Dorothy's funeral. I combed my hair, polished my shoes, and drove next door to pick up a woman who lived 30 feet away. Margaret opened the door wearing a dark green dress and a string of pearls that had been Frank's last anniversary gift to her. She looked beautiful. I told her so. She said, "You clean up well for a man who spends most of his time in flannel." We went to the little Italian place on Main Street. The owner, a man named Gino who had known Dorothy and me for 20 years, looked at us when we walked in, and his eyes went wide. Then he smiled, led us to the best table by the window, and brought a candle without being asked. We ordered pasta and red wine, and talked until the restaurant was almost empty. She told me about the first time Frank kissed her, at a school dance in 1976. I told her about proposing to Dorothy in the parking lot of a grocery store, because I couldn't wait any longer, and the ring was burning a hole in my pocket. We laughed at ourselves. Two old fools sitting in a restaurant acting like teenagers who had just discovered that the world was bigger than they thought. When I drove her home, I walked her to her door. She turned and looked at me under the porch light. "I want you to know something," she said. "I'm not trying to take Dorothy's place. I would never do that." I took her hand. "And I'm not trying to take Frank's." She nodded. "But I also don't want to spend whatever time I have left pretending I don't feel this." "Neither do I," I said. She leaned up and kissed my cheek. "Good night, Walter. Good night, Margaret." I walked back to my house and stood in the kitchen. 2 plates were still on the table from that morning. I picked up the second plate, the one that had been Dorothy's for 43 years. I held it in my hands for a long time. Then I opened the cabinet and set it gently inside. Tomorrow morning, I would set 1 plate, and when Margaret came over for breakfast, I would set another. Not out of habit, not out of grief, out of choice. Christmas Eve was when my children finally met her. Karen drove down from Minneapolis with her husband Robert. Michael flew in from Denver alone, as usual. They arrived in the afternoon and found the house decorated with lights Margaret had helped me hang. There was a wreath on the door and the smell of gingerbread inside because Margaret had spent the morning baking. Karen walked in first. She looked around the kitchen and saw the single place setting on the table. She looked at me, and I saw something shift behind her eyes. She didn't say anything, but I think she understood. When Margaret came over that evening, carrying a platter of roasted vegetables and a bottle of wine, Karen was polite, but watchful. Michael was worse. He shook Margaret's hand like he was interviewing her for a job. "So Margaret," he said, leaning against the counter with his arms crossed, "what did you do before you retired?" "I was a school librarian for 28 years, she said, unfazed. Michael nodded slowly. "And your husband was a teacher?" "Yes. Frank taught history at East Waterloo High." "How long were you married?" 34 years. "Michael," I said quietly. He ignored me. "And you moved here because?" "Because the house I shared with Frank felt too empty to live in alone," she said. Her voice was steady, but I could see the effort behind it. "I imagine you understand that feeling, Michael. Your father told me about your mother. She was clearly a remarkable woman." Michael went still. Karen looked at Margaret with new eyes. Margaret didn't flinch. She didn't try to win them over with charm or deflection. She just stood in my kitchen, honest and unafraid, and let them see who she was. Later that night, after dinner, Karen pulled me aside in the hallway. "She's not what I expected," she said. "What did you expect?" "I don't know. Someone who was trying too hard. She's just real." I looked at my daughter. "She reminds me of your mother in that way." Karen's eyes filled up. She hugged me without saying anything else. Michael took longer. He sat on the porch with me after everyone else had gone inside. The night was cold and clear, stars everywhere. "I don't want you to get hurt, Dad," he said. "I know, but I need to tell you something, and I need you to hear it." He waited. "For 5 years I set 2 plates every morning. I talked to your mother every night. I kept her roses even though they went wild. I held on to everything because letting go felt like losing her all over again." He was quiet. "Margaret didn't ask me to let go. She just sat down at the table and filled the space that was already empty. She didn't replace your mother. She reminded me that I was still alive." Michael stared at the sky for a long time. Then he put his hand on my shoulder. "Okay, Dad." That was all he said. But it was enough. Spring came the way it always does in Iowa. Slow and muddy and full of promise. Margaret and I cleaned out Dorothy's old rose bed and planted new flowers alongside the ones that had survived. We put in tomatoes and herbs and a row of sunflowers along the back fence, because Margaret said every garden needed something tall to look up to. We fell into a rhythm. Breakfast at my table, coffee on her porch, Walks around the block in the afternoon when the weather was good. Evenings spent reading in the same room, her in the chair by the window, me on the couch, both of us quiet but not alone. One afternoon in April, I found her sitting in the garden looking at a small bird that had landed on the fence. She was crying. I sat down beside her. Frank used to love watching the birds, she said. He had a book. He could name every one. I took her hand. You can miss him and still be here with me. Those two things don't cancel each other out. She leaned against my shoulder. How did you get so wise at 70? I'm not wise. I'm just old enough to have made every mistake at least twice. She laughed, and the bird flew away, and we sat in the garden together until the sun went down. In May, I asked Margaret to marry me. We were sitting on the porch, watching the elm trees fill out with new leaves. I didn't have a ring yet. I didn't have a speech. I just had a feeling that had been growing in my chest for months, and a clear understanding that at our age, waiting was the one luxury we couldn't afford. Margaret, I said. She looked at me. I want to spend whatever time I have left with you. Not next door. Not across the fence. Here, together, in this house. Will you marry me? She was quiet for what felt like a very long time. Then she said, I thought you'd never ask, you stubborn old man. I laughed. She laughed. And there on the porch where I had sat alone for 5 years, watching the street and missing my wife, I kissed the woman who had given me the courage to set one plate instead of two. We got married in June, in the backyard, under the elm trees. Karen came with Robert and their 2 kids. Michael flew in and brought a woman he'd been dating, which was a surprise to everyone. Claire, Margaret's daughter, drove down from Chicago. She had been easier about everything than my children. When Margaret told her about me, Claire had simply said, Mom, if he makes you happy, that's all I need to know. The ceremony was small. Pastor Davis kept it short because he knew neither of us had the patience for long speeches. Margaret wore a pale blue dress and carried wildflowers from the garden we had planted together. I wore my good suit again, the same one from our first date, and this time it felt right instead of borrowed. When I slipped the ring on her finger, a simple gold band I had picked out at the jeweler's in town, my hands were shaking, not from nerves, from gratitude, from the overwhelming understanding that life had given me something I never expected to receive again. Margaret looked at me with those clear, steady eyes. She whispered, I love you, Walter. I whispered back, I love you too, every day, for as long as we get. That night, after everyone had gone home, Margaret and I sat in the kitchen, our kitchen. She looked at the table. One plate sat on one side, another plate sat across from it. Both had been used. Both were waiting to be washed. She reached across the table and took my hand. Do you still talk to Dorothy at night? I smiled. Sometimes. But these days, I mostly just say thank you. What for? For the years she gave me. And for somehow making sure I was ready when you knocked on my door with a casserole. Margaret squeezed my hand. I talk to Frank too. I tell him about the garden, and the sunflowers, and the stubborn neighbor who took 3 months to invite me to dinner. I laughed. He sounds like a patient man to listen to all that. She smiled. He would have liked you. I looked across the table at my wife, my second chance, the woman who had asked me to set a place for her, and in doing so had reminded me that love doesn't end when you bury someone. It just waits, quietly, patiently, until you're brave enough to reach for it again. I used to think my story ended when Dorothy died. I used to think 70 years was enough life for one man, that everything after was just filling time until the lights went out. But Margaret taught me something I wish I had known sooner. Love at our age isn't less than what it was at 20. It's more. Because at 20, you think you have forever. At 70, you know you don't. And that knowledge doesn't make love smaller. It makes every single morning you wake up beside someone feel like a gift you never want to waste. If you've ever lost someone you thought you couldn't live without, and then found the courage to love again, you know exactly what I mean. And if you haven't found that courage yet, I want you to know something from an old man who set 2 plates every morning for 5 years because he was too afraid to admit the chair was empty. The chair is empty, but your life doesn't have to be. All it takes is one knock on the door, one casserole, one quiet voice saying, set a place for me, and everything changes.